Indecent Advances starts in the years after World War I and takes us through to the late 1960s, right before the Stonewall riots of 1969. This tells three stories, really. The first story is of these true crimes between the 1920s and 1960s. These crime stories of murders and assaults of queer men in hotel rooms, their apartments, in public parks, were for the most part never read since they were first published. They were found in urban tabloids as well as small town and regional newspapers. The second story is about a history of sexuality of the 20th century, how the medical establishment and criminologists defined sexual deviancy in that period from biological defect to a certain psychological defect. And the third story is about a social movement and how homosexuals began to see themselves as a sexual minority in the decade and a half before Stonewall. And the crime stories became a key factor in how homosexual activists began to understand how they suffered as citizens within the society. The research itself was its own detective story, because it wasn't as if the newspapers were publishing explicitly that these crime stories involved queer men. The word homosexuality didn't really appear in the press that often until the 1940s or 50s, and even then only in studies of psychology or medicine. So finding these stories became its own process of detection, looking for clues, reading between the lines. In researching the databases, I was often putting in terms like sailor found murdered in hotel room or man found beaten in park. Once I found some of these stories and began to dig deeper into these search terms, I uncovered a whole range of articles that clearly involved queer men. And that really compelled me, both in terms of telling these stories that had been lost, as well as bringing those stories into some kind of historical narrative. The inspiration for this project came when I encountered the homoerotic scrapbooks of Carl van Vechten. Van Vechten had collected all kinds of ephemera about queer life between the 1920s and the 1950s. This included flyers for drag balls, advertisements for queer novels, and other kinds of material that either he found or he cut out of newspapers and magazines. Mixed in and juxtaposed against these documents were stories of queer true crime from the newspapers. And he would underline certain parts of these stories, pointing to what's just underneath, what the press wasn't being explicit about. And it really inspired me, made me think about the ways in which true crime was so vital to the history of queer experience during that period. I think this book is really important because not only does it recover these stories, but it gives a bit of justice to these victims who in the press and in the courtroom were really seen as culpable in the crimes themselves. Gay men at the time were criminalized, and so these murders were seen as part of the very problem of homosexuality. And many of these men, they were married, some with children, some who lived as gay men, were never given the justice they deserved. And I'm hoping that this book can at least reach towards that.